you said that there were things that when you started writing The Work Revolves as a short story, that there were things that clearly pointed you toward its novelhood.
Mm-hmm.
And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about what those things were. How did
The
you know it was
main
supposed to
thing
be a novel?
was Willie, this German kid. I mean, when I realized I had a German exchange student in the book, and this whole backstory, of speaking of backstory, of his father, I assumed I was going to work that in. Well, that's an immense story. And in order to get that in, I'm just seeing this is going to be a novel. It's going to be a much bigger project than I thought it would be. So that's really the main thing. And that led to, Mary was talking about the myth in the book. And I told my class I'm really influenced by the Bible, because I spent many days and hours of my childhood listening to New and Old Testament stories. So that Abraham and Isaac myth is, I think, a fascinating story. It's a story about obedience that really is non-human. I mean, what kind of father kills his son? I mean, in order to, that's crazy, and yet that myth is a founding myth. I mean, Abraham is the founder of Christianity and Islam and Judaism. Three really powerful mythologies that have spread through the world. They come out of that story in many ways. And so part of what I wanted to do with this book was to deal with, what are the repercussions of that story. And so it is kind of permeating the book in all sorts of ways, and that also, I suppose, is part of what makes it a novel. You're not going to adequately deal with the kinds of things I'm trying to deal with in a short story. There. Yeah.
There's an interesting twist in the way you handle the Abraham and Isaac story, in that the person who's telling the story to Willie, his
Mhm.
father, is really interested in Isaac's point of view.
Yeah.
He identifies with Isaac and the idea of being born for the purpose of sacrifice.
Which is another thing that this novel led me to, and that is the Lebensborn program in Nazi Germany, which I did not know about, but I kind of ran into it in doing research. And I was researching the Nazis and really the children of Nazis. I was reading up on what is the psychology of being a children or a grandchildren of a Nazi. And I ran into this Lebensborn stuff, which is kind of the flip side of the Holocaust. It was an attempt to raise pure Aryan men, primarily for the 1,000-year Reich, which is an Isaac story, isn't it? It's the story of because then they'd be the soldiers. And so I realized that's really a kind of a perverted Isaac story. They're being sacrificed to the Reich if it had worked. And so there were Lebensborn houses where the Nazis had young women who were breeders for who were supposed to raise these children. And so when I hit that Lebensborn thing, I just grew horrified and fascinated, and read everything I could about it. And that is so there you see the Abraham and Isaac thing and the Nazi thing. They get locked together in my imagination, and that Isaac becomes the viewpoint I take in the book. Yeah. And I hope this is all interesting, people, to those who haven't read the book yet. I hope you're not just going, oh God, this guy's just talking about his own interests. But I hope that I'm giving you some sense of how the book evolved. I didn't have these things sitting there saying I'm gonna by God write a book about Lebensborn. I mean, Lebensborn came through research, and then I said, well, geez, I can't just leave that on the table. It's got to get in here somehow. So. Yeah, Brad.
So you mentioned resistance earlier, and I've been thinking about this since then. And and including sort of the backstory, are there formal ways to resist, other than like literally resisting sitting down and writing this particular scene? Are there formal ways in a novel, a story? So this is a question for both of you too, to like resist within the formal structure of this, and what other ways, if writing background is one way or not one way? So I guess it's more of a formal question about or structural question.
I don't know what you mean by resistance, Brett. Would you just define what you're talking about?
Well, so I guess like if I'm writing like a poem and there's like the tension between like line and sentence, right? So and there's like you can have like resistance to something. You can like push something down line to line. And I'm wondering in prose what ways there might be to resist something formally or structurally. Or maybe if resistance isn't the right word, but to like not, if you're not avoiding writing this particular scene, right? So keep going back to what you said about you had to like figure out how you were going to write this, or if you were going to write it, and
right.
resisting writing it. Are there formal choices that also serve as like a resistance to writing something, or delaying something, or embedding something?
It seems to me that one of the things the novelist has to learn in the process, and I was listening with close attention to a number of drafts Kent took this book through and what he discovered about his characters as he went. And I think one of the things the novelist is doing is discovering all the backstory.
That's well said.
And as well as the present story,
Right.
because the backstory, of course, informs the present story. The difficulty is the risk is that if you linger too far in the backstory, the reader loses track of the present story.
Right.
And I think what it gets down to, finally, is a choice that we all make as writers. What do we include and what do we leave out? Hemingway, again. Much of your intensity comes from what you choose to leave out, but if you know it well, the reader will know it without knowing how he or she knows it. And I'm not, well, of course, I'm not Hemingway, so that probably makes all the difference in the world. But I've never quite felt like I was on that solid ground. But I think that's one of the issues is how to self-edit, how to decide what to leave, and of course, and what to keep and what not to keep. And of course, that's where a reader comes into. And you mentioned the readers that have helped you.
Right. Well, yeah, I do always have at least 5 or 6 people read drafts for me, and that may be a partial answer to your question, Brett, that I'm just so dependent on other people. I'm the furthest thing from this independent artist who does everything on his own, and so that may be a partial answer. I really depend on people to tell me, you just really screwed that up, and you better do it differently. But Mary also, gives me some insights into another answer, and that is that in this particular novel, that scene, resisting that scene, thinking, oh God, that's a graphic scene, it's a ugly scene, it's a scene you really wish wouldn't happen, and so you kind of resist writing it. But as this book evolves, if I'm really paying attention to my own writing, things shape up through the drafts that speak to the major questions of the book. And one of the things that began to shape up in this book is I realized I was writing a book about how knowledge takes channels. And it gets lost in one channel and it gets picked up in another channel. And that really came about as a result of this German Lakota thing, because while I was researching the Indianer clubs in Germany, and they are a bunch of blonde, blue-eyed people who get together and they dress up like Indians and like Linda Hazelton does with the Rendezvous, they do this in Germany. They're the Indianer clubs.
One of my favorite parts is when Ted kills many.
Ted kills many.
He's talking to Billy, and Billy's been telling him about the Indianer societies, and Ted says, well, we've got these here, we call them the Berliner societies, and we dress up in lederhosen. the humor throughout.
Yeah.
And the dialogue. One of the things that will just turn me off is when I'm reading dialogue, that I just don't think that person would have said it that way.
Yeah.
But these characters, I can always know.
That's cool.
There's no mistaking Will's voice. No mistaking Earl's voice or Carson's, who doesn't say much, actually.
Doesn't say much, no. No.
Yeah, very much in keeping. Dialogue is difficult.
It's very difficult. Yeah. I think I told the class I think dialogue often should be written as a form of modified poetry, where you. I mean, you are listening for the intonations and the inflections and the ways people talk. It's got to give the impression of realism, of naturalism. But I think often you achieve that through a kind of sensitivity to rhythm, as much as you do through anything else. And so I don't know if that's true or not, but I love writing dialogue. I really do like writing it, and so yeah.
Brett, did you get your question answered?
Well, I didn't quite finish this answer. The answer was that the Germans actually do know things about Lakota culture
Yeah.
that the Lakota don't.
And
Because
Billy is
they're-
happy to explain.
And they're happy to explain it. They're happy to tell you what they know. And when I was in Germany, I called up a woman who, there are a lot of Lakota people in Germany because they go there as part of the military, and I called up a woman who is the Lakota head of a powwow for Lakota people in Germany. And I asked her to talk to her about the Germans' interest in Lakota culture, and she got on a rant on the phone for 45 minutes complaining about these Germans who would call her up. They'd go to her powwow, and then they'd call her up and they'd say, you're not doing it right. That's, because it was done this way, and but in some ways what's funny is they're holding on to something. They're preserving an older way of doing something that has been changed through the living culture. And so I was really intrigued with that and so one of the things that gets answered in a late draft of the book, and I'm coming back to Brett's question now, is that business of who has the knowledge to answer this question. And they finally say, we don't know. Mm-hmm. And so we're left kind of inventing what we have to do. And it was almost that recognition that really solidified, okay, that is what they have to do, because there is no tradition anymore in this particular moment to say this is the right way to do things. Mm-hmm. And so what I'm trying to give all of you is a sense of how I in holding that question open, how it gets nudged or scented differently with each draft of the book, and this business of the book being about strands of knowledge and how it gets lost or comes through ruptures through other means was a fairly late recognition for me that I'm writing about that. And once I recognized it, then it began to influence certain decisions or solidify them. Yeah. And I hope that is an answer, Brett, that does some good.
Yeah, no.
Okay. Anything else?
The idea of who has the memory, how often Carson will think about things his dead grandfather would have known.
Yeah, all the time.
Trivia
Yes,
sometimes.
Yes.
He would have known whose cars were parked back here.
Mhm.
He would have known whose wrecked car that was and how it got wrecked.
Yes. And if you've read Twisted Tree, you'll see that same. I was so interested in it that it just bled into my next book. Twisted Tree is the next book, and Twisted Tree is very much about knowledge that is lost and then contained, and And often the people who contain it are unable to express it. And so then you've got a really interesting, like Shane Balin in Twisted Tree is the guy who really, frankly, knows everything. But he doesn't know he knows it. You know, the woman in Twisted Tree who's searching for the grave of the dead child that her father's hired hand that he helped him bury, and she's obsessed with finding this grave, and she knows that between these two trees, somewhere in the cemetery, well, Shane's the one who knows where the two trees are, but he doesn't know he knows it, and he doesn't know that she needs that information. And so, and that kind of thing is all through that book. This person knows something, but this person needs the knowledge. But those two people are not in communion. They're not connected to each other. And so, if you do read that book, and you really ought to, I think. You will see that sort of thing happening all over it, which is one of the funnest things about writing it. Was you know, hinting that this person knows what that person needs. Yeah. Do you have questions about that book? Anybody who read it? Anything you want me to say about it?
Well, you know, that's true, but all those things, that knowledge it all kind of exists as secrets.
Mm-hmm.
You know. And you're, as a reader, I'm thinking about, oh, this town is just full of secrets.
It's full of secrets, yeah.
And full of questions.
Right.
Why did, Billy asks, why did my father try to kill himself? And why didn't he? Many people ask or imply, how did Carson's grandfather really die? And Carson won't tell the story.
Right.
Though he lets the reader know. Why did Rebecca marry the millionaire? And Earl, why won't my mother and my uncle talk to each other?
Right, yeah. And that the work of Wolves partly is about the resolution of that. You know, by the end of the book, the boys are talking. Mm-hmm. They've opened up to each other's stories. Twisted Tree, I'm not sure that ever happens. You know, but I think in the work of Wolves, they at least open up to the possibility of engaging each other's stories. You know, and so does Greggy Longwell, the cop. I mean, he stops the boys at one point at the end of the book, and he says, and they think, oh my God, we're done for. You know, we're going to get arrested for what we did, and he just says, you hear that? And they say, we don't hear anything. He says, yeah, that's right. And he means that the town's not talking, and if the town's not talking, then I'm not going to push it.
I've forgotten your name.
Yeah.
Well, just maybe we've got a few minutes. A good friend of yours and mine, actually, Stan Rubin, remarked to me a couple of years ago, Kent's writing's getting very darker and darker. And, you know, there is a dark aspect to all this. There are some awful things that happen, but it doesn't seem dark in its world, let's say its total concept of the world.
Right.
That these boys survive in their own ways.
Right, they do.
And they make choices.
They do, yes.
And they feel at the end, I think, that they made the right choices.
Right. I think that book has a fairly, what's the word? Redemptive? I don't like the word necessarily, but a fairly redemptive ending. Yeah, I mean, they do some dark things, but I think that it's ultimately a redemptive ending, and it's in that opening up to the other person's worldview and the other person's story that I think that book finally, my feeling is, or my hope is, that it says that's how we survive in a world where awful things can happen, and they do that. Twisted Tree probably is a darker book, but I think that book too, I hope has that, at least an ending, where the people again connect. There's another frozen lake and car scene in that book, but I think that last chapter suggests that. In some ways, in that last chapter, Twisted Tree, my attempt was to say that the knowledge has been handed over to another community, and who will deal with it, hopefully better than the community that was holding it. And I think that also is redemptive, that, you know, when knowledge is held and hoarded, that strikes me as a rigidity in the world that has got to be shattered. And so the redemptive sense in that book for me is that rigidity gets shattered, and then the hoarding of the knowledge gets passed to people who can, I hope, deal with it in better ways. So I think that is a darker book, but again, I don't think of myself as I mean, I do love tragedy. I do love it as a writer, as a reader, but I don't want to just leave people completely depressed either. You know, I try to lift it up.
The
in
last
some
thing
ways.
Hamlet says to Horatio is to tell my story.
Tell the story. That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yes, Max.
Well, there's also this kind of really frightening irony, and maybe it was just me who had that experience in reading Twisted Tree, was when you know the I-9 murderer wants to know all he can, all these secrets of his latest victim, who then is tied to everything that follows.
Right.
But and yet there I am as a reader going through the rest of the book, just like this I-90 killer, wanting to know all the secrets of everybody in the town's Twisted Tree, and it's like you did that to us to kind of mess with us.
Kind of. Yeah.
It's a bit of an uncomfortable.
Yeah.
Fit.
And what's funny about that is the delight you can take in writing really horrible things. I mean, that the first chapter of Twisted Tree, it's the last thing I wrote in the book, the very last chapter I wrote. But it is. People tell me, my God, I could hardly read that chapter.
The prologue?
The one where the I-90 killer picks up Haley Joe Zimmerman at the Rushmore Mall and abducts her and is going to murder her. But I giggled writing that chapter. I was just having so much fun writing this awful, awful stuff. And so, for kind of the reasons Max is talking about, that you know you're doing this thing that's ironic, and I know people are going to get sucked into it, and they're going to go, oh, I don't want to read this, but I can't help but read it. and it's, you're laughing to yourself. I mean, I did. I was literally sitting there giggling at some of the worst things in that chapter.
You are so cool.
It's terrible. I know.
Well, after all that complexity, you're all ready to go out and write novels?
That novel, by the way, I had for a while on my website. I'm so terrible with keeping the websites, but I index that entire book. Every single character in that book, who, even ones unnamed, like a waitress who pours coffee, got indexed. And so because what I'm doing is, in the book, if you really read it carefully, is you will see like the semi that passes Lowell Bresnan and makes his car shake on the freeway. That's Lowell Bresnan, the semi, who has a chapter later in the book. And so I indexed every single person where they appear in the book, and indexing was incredible fun. I thought, oh my God, this is going to be so boring. I would be a professional indexer if I could. It was the funnest thing out to do that. And then I wrote little bitty mini stories for most of those characters, and that was an 18-page addition to the book, that I had on a website for a number of years until I got lazy and let the website lapse. But
That is one of the difficulties with the longer work, is trying to remember, let's see now, on what page did the dog die? And it's,
Exactly.
because you've got all this, nowadays, you've got all this stuff on a computer. And what are you going to do? Start scrolling through to find? So I started keeping notes like that,
Yeah.
not quite that elaborate, but yeah, writing down, you know, and it was kind of a moving target because the dog would die on a different page as I rewrote. But, but it was sure
Damn
better
dogs,
than a lot of, yeah.
they just won't die on the same page. But yeah, it's really interesting problem. And you've got a real complex novel, and you're trying to weave this stuff together. How do you keep track of that?
Yeah.
And the second thing I had to do, since we're talking about craft, is I had to tape about 6 pieces of paper together, and then do a timeline for every single birth and death. I had to make up all the births and deaths of everybody in the book, because I found myself crossing generations, where in one chapter, someone would be in one generation, and then the other one should be in another generation. I can't have that happening. And so I had to align all those births and deaths to be sure that they were in the proper
And then
generation.
what was going on in the
Yeah.
larger world while all this was taking
Yeah,
place?
you had to figure all that out. So those are the 2 major things underneath that book that I had to get straight in order to keep the book working. But they were both a lot of fun.
I think we're at time too.
Okay.
Yeah. Thank you so much for doing this. Yeah, please give one more.